In order to remember more deeply about the concept of competitive dynamics, let's review the related paper during this semester, starting with the first paper, Action Characteristics as Predictors of Competitive Response, 1992, by focusing on competitive actions, which provokes counteractions. The main purposes for this research are, first, to highlight the significance of responses in competitive dynamics while proposing two important response attributes: number of responses and response lag. Second, to investigate the competitive implications of various attributes of action. The characteristics of actions comprised of competitive impact, attack intensity, implementation requirement, and type of action, strategic versus tactical. And the last purpose is to demonstrate that competitive responses may be predicted based on the characteristics of the initial actions. Authors emphasized that the elements of the stimulus response model, awareness, motivation, and capability, provide a theoretical underpinning for studying the relationships between characteristics of actions and responses. The results showed that the total number of competitors affected by an action and the importance to these competitors of the markets under attack by the actions increased the number of competitive responses. Strategic actions reduce the number and delay timing of rivals' counteractions. Finally, contrary to prediction, competitors who have a high stake in the markets under attack by a competitive move react slowly. Let's move to the second paper, Competitive Attack, Retaliation and Performance, and Expectancy Valence Framework, 1994, by examining how competitive attacks can best reduce the chances of retaliation. It seeks to identify just what it is about attack behavior that elicits or averts retaliatory responses, and it goes on to explore the performance implications of retaliation. An expectancy valence model is developed that views retaliation as a function of the subtlety of an attack. That is, its visibility, the difficulty rivals might have in responding to it in kind, and the importance or centrality to rivals of the market under siege. Each one of the independent variables could serve as the weak link of the chain, increasing the chances of retaliation. However, as predicted by expectancy theory, these variables selectively demonstrated some interactions that compound the threat of retaliation. In combination, high visibility and low levels of difficulty were especially likely to evoke responses from rivals. Finally, there appears to be a real incentive to avoid retaliation, given its negative associations with performance. Continue with the third paper, Non-Response and Delayed Response to Competitive Moves, the Roles of Competitor Dependence and Action Irreversibility, 1992. The principal purpose of this research was to identify variables strategy researchers can use to compensate for incompleteness of information when studying the basic building block of competitive interaction, the action-response dyad. Authors identified two important variables that may play such a role in variance reduction: competitor dependence and the irreversibility. Furthermore, this study used the reversibility of action and competitor dependence to predict the following dimensions of response: the likelihood of non-response from a given competitor, response delay, and likelihood of a matching response. The results suggest that competitor dependence depresses chances of non-response and increases response delay and the likelihood that a responder will match a move. Action irreversibility generally has the opposite effect. In addition, the interaction of competitor dependence and action irreversibility is significant. Analyses of the performance implications of competitive exchange indicated that attackers and early responders gain market share at the expense of late responders and non-responders. The next paper, Organizational Information Processing, Competitive Responses and Performance in the U.S. Domestic Airline Industry was written by Smith, Grimm, Gannon, and Chen, 1991, to examine how firms build competitive advantage by focusing on the specific actions and responses of competitor. The purposes of the study were to test hypotheses predicting competitors' responses and to link variations in response to performance. The authors identified four important attributes of response: likelihood, likely to respond, leg, respond slowly, order, the position in a temporal series of responses a firm occupies, and imitation, the degree to which a response mimics an action, and then explaining them in terms of the information processing dimensions represented by the first type of action, strategic or tactical, to which a firm is responding; second, the sensory systems of responding firms; third, information processing and analyzing mechanisms. Decision makers in structurally complex firms will receive information on competitors late and receive less rich. And fourth, decision-making processes. Organizational slack can influence the speed exhaustiveness of a decision-maker's information search. The findings supported the notion that a firm's response can be predicted from the manner in which it interprets and processes information. Further, response likelihood, response lag, and response order were related to performance. Let's continue with the next one: speed, stealth, and selective attack. How small firms differ from large firms in competitive behavior. This paper explored two related questions. First, how do small firms differ from their large rivals in their competitive behaviors? To answer question 1, a firm can be considered small in two different but related ways: in terms of sheer organizational size or in terms of its industry market share. Large size has been seen as giving a firm such advantages as economies of scale, experience, brand name recognition, and market power. Smallness has been credited with increasing flexibility in production, price, with enhancing speed and risk-seeking behavior. Therefore, the small firms in an industry can be as successful as their large rivals. However, their success is determined mainly by the competitive strategies they employ. In reality, competition is a dynamic process by which market participants engage each other through a series of moves and counter moves. Therefore, it is important to move the level of analysis to the basic building blocks of competitive strategy, actions, and responses. Question 2. Do the competitive behaviors associated with good business performance differ for small and large firms? To answer question 2, the results shows out that the small airlines more actively initiated competitive challenges and were speedy but low-key, even secretive, in executing their action. They were also slower to respond when attacked and, contrary to expectations, their responses were more visible than those of their larger opponents. Deviations from group norms hurt performance for both large and small firms. Move to another paper: the influence of top management team heterogeneity on firms' competitive moves. A firm's competitive behaviors consist of its moves and counter moves, or its actions and responses to adversaries' actions. The top team can be considered as the aggregate informational and decisional entity through which competitive moves are made. These moves depend on the team's scanning of the environment, recognizing problems and opportunities, and interpreting other external stimuli, developing potential moves, negotiating, refining and selecting moves, and implementing decisions. This paper examined the relationships between top management team heterogeneity and three major dimensions of a firm's actions and responses. First, its competitive propensity, or its relative tendency to undertake actions and respond to competitors' actions. Second, the competitive magnitude, or the relative scale and significance of the firm's action and responses. Third, competitive speed, or how quickly the firm implements its actions and responds to others' actions. The results showed out that the top management teams that were diverse in terms of functional backgrounds, education, and company tenure exhibited a relatively great propensity for action, and both their actions and responses were of substantial magnitude. Heterogeneous teams, by contrast, were slower in their actions and responses, and less likely than homogeneous teams to respond to competitors' initiatives. Thus, although team heterogeneity is a double-edged sword, its overall net effect on airline performance in terms of changes in market share and profits. Continue with another paper, The Simplicity of Competitive Repertoires. An Empirical Analysis, 1996. The research explores the notion of competitive simplicity, a tendency of some firms to concentrate intensely on just a few central activities. Their focus here is the simplicity inherent in the repertoire of concrete, market-oriented actions used by companies to compete. These actions include product introductions, pricing or advertising decisions, and changes in market scope. Competitive simplicity may be manifested in at least three related aspects of competitive repertoires. These we call range, concentration, and dominance. The range, concentration, and dominance aspects of simplicity reflect restriction in the range of market-oriented actions, or the tendency to focus on only a few kinds of actions. Competitive simplicity will be influenced by two essential factors. First, it will be a function of search incentives that induce managers to look for and embrace additional ways of competing. These may take the form of poor performance and other sources of threat and uncertainty. Second, competitive simplicity will be a function of managers' knowledge about the different ways of competing. This knowledge will be enhanced by prior experience with various competitive methods and by exposure to a diversity of rivals and clients. Next is the paper, Sources and Consequences of Competitive Inertia, a study of the U.S. airline industry, 1994. Competitive inertia is defined as the level of activity that a firm exhibits when altering its competitive stance in areas such as pricing, advertising, new product or service introductions, and market scope. Competitive inertia may be influenced by the constraints on action caused by bureaucratic rigidity, insularity, and institutional networks, all of which tend to be related to a company's age and size. There are several reasons why good performance may give rise to inertia. First, reinforcements, rewards, and punishments. Good performance induces managers to believe that they have gotten it right. It makes them reluctant to change. Second, scanning and search. Success may be interpreted as a sign that less vigilance and less environmental scanning or search are required, and this attitude can blind managers to the need for action. Third, power, politics, and managerial attributions. Success creates corporate cultures that make company or departmental leaders into power centers, into heroes with the status and resources to perpetuate both their stewardship and their policies. Success thus makes power self-perpetuating, and this dampens new competitive initiatives. Let's move to the next paper, Nonconformity in Competitive Repertoires, a Sociological View of Markets, 1996. This paper uses a sociological framework to identify factors influencing competitive nonconformity. The author argued that the extensiveness and continuity of the company's market interactions very much influence its level of nonconformity. Factors in the social context that might influence nonconformity include, first, the diversity of market, diversity in the set of competitors, and customers. Second, industry traditions. The time since market upheaval and organizations linked to social context, firm size, and slack resources. In airline industries, big and small firms face similar regulatory scrutiny, and considerable resources are needed for many kinds of originality. Under these circumstances, authors tend to favor the network and resource dependency arguments. The findings also show that competitive nonconformity was associated with subsequent declines in financial performance, but mainly for smaller airlines with homogeneous markets. This study supported some central notions from the sociology of markets and, with qualification, from institutional. Another paper in this section, Competitor Analysis and Interfirm Rivalry Toward the Theoretical Integration, 1996. This article bridges two important subjects in strategy, competitor analysis and interfirm rivalry. Through a refined conceptualization of competitor analysis, the article introduces two firm-specific, theory-based constructs, market commonality, developed from the literature on multiple-point competition, and resource similarity, derived from the resource-based theory of the firm. The joint consideration of these two constructs shows the complementarity of these two prominent but contrasting strategy theories. The idea of competitive asymmetry is introduced, that is, the notion that a given pair of firms may not pose an equal degree of threat to each other. To illustrate competitor mapping, measures of these two constructs are proposed, and an example is offered. The article ends with a number of implications for research and practice. The next paper, Multi-Market Maneuvering in Uncertain Spheres of Influence, Resource Diversion Strategies, 1998. This article focused on how a firm can strategically use corporate-level resource allocations to reconfigure spheres of influence in multi-market competition. The authors examined how one firm can influence competitive context by influencing the resource allocations of another through a process we term strategic resource diversion, the aspect of multiple point competition that leads us to explore the potential for using decisions about corporate resource allocation as mechanisms for proactively restructuring the competitive context. This suggests that corporate strategy needs to take two premises into account. First, the overriding objective is to achieve the best long-term rent-generating position for the corporation as a whole, not to maximize any individual subsidiary unit's performance. Second, to achieve this objective, companies must actively coordinate and integrate the interdependencies among different subsidiaries. The competitive rivalry literature has yielded two ideas that are germane to strategic resource diversion. First, the study of the exchange of competitive attacks and responses can help in analyzing rivalry, and two, factors such as the attributes of the attack, the degree of the attacker's commitment, and the importance of the attacked markets to the defender can predict response behaviors. Following a military analogy, authors explore three stratagems: thrusts, feints, and gambits. The last paper, Competitive Tension, 2007. This article formalizes the construct of competitive tension, defined as the strain between a focal firm and a given rival that is likely to result in the firm taking action against the rival. The authors first investigate the extent to which such firm dyad variables as relative scale, rivals' attack volume, and rivals' capability to contest derived from the awareness motivation capability perspective can predict perceived tension. Research has identified three underlying drivers of rival behavior: awareness of a competitive relationship and/or competitors' initiatives, motivation to act or respond, and the capability to do so. In this study, perceived competitive tension denotes the extent to which a firm's managers and industry stakeholders consider a given rival to be the focal firm's primary competitor whereas objective structural tension relates to the ever-changing industry structure or market conditions in which rivals operate. Most importantly, tension, as it is conceptualized here, describes the state of latent strain that precipitates the breaking point when strain becomes manifest through competitive actions. Thus, tension defines the forces that build up and tend to pull a static interfirm relationship into dynamic behavioral interplay between rivals. Although both objective and perceptual considerations are essential, the empirical focus of this study is perceived tension. The research conceptualizes competitive tension, a construct intended to close a significant gap in the strategy and competitor analysis literature. That's all the papers of Professor Chen. Ming Jia, a leading authority in strategic management, is known for his pioneering work in competitive dynamics and his expertise in Chinese Western business. Hope you guys have a clearly picture about competitive dynamics based on those papers. Thank you for sharing your time.